Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Anna Akhmatova, or as her real name was, Anna Andreevna Gorenko. Anna Andreevna Gorenko was born into a noble family in Odessa. Her father was from Ukrainian nobility and was a naval engineer. Her mother's side of the family was also of the nobility, but from Russian nobility, and supposedly descended from a Khan Akhmat, who was a descendant of Genghis Khan. And so Anna Andreevna took her pen name Akhmatova from that side of the family, from her grandmother's maiden name Akhmatova. She did so because her father asked her not to publish under her own name. He didn't want her to embarrass the family by publishing as Anna Gorenko. And while she was born in Odessa, shortly after her birth, the family moved to Tsarskoye Selo, and she spent most of her life in St. Petersburg, or as it later became known, Leningrad. So despite her Ukrainian roots, she was very much a St. Petersburg writer. As we discussed in the lecture on Acmeism, Acmeism was a very St. Petersburg movement, and she was very tied into the St. Petersburg literary scene and sort of the St. Petersburg artistic aesthetic overall. Anna Andreevna began writing poetry quite early. Like many of the poets we have seen here, she showed a lot of early talent and began writing when she was in her early teens. Also, when she was still in her fairly early teens, she attracted the romantic admiration of Nikolai Gumilyov, and he pursued her quite aggressively for several years, and they ended up marrying in 1910. Her family was not happy about the marriage and did not attend the wedding. Also in 1910, she was a founding member of the Guild of Poets, Sekh Poetov, that we discussed in the lecture on Acmeism. And it was through the Guild of Poets that her first poetry collection, Evening, or Вечер, was published in 1912. It was soon followed by a second collection, Rosary, or Chutki, that came out in 1914. And she published a number of collections in the 1910s and quickly gained fame for her poetry, which was seen as this wonderful new thing in Russian poetry, both because of its distinctly feminine voice and because of its Acmeist influence and style. She also gained a lot of personal fame for her looks and her intense magnetic allure. She was generally considered not to be a beauty in the classical sense, but she was considered to have some element of intense attraction about her. She had a number of affairs with other poets in this period. Her marriage with Gumilyov was not happy and collapsed in 1918. And before and after that, she had a number of affairs. She was widely admired, and her poetry at the time is mainly about difficult relationships between men and women. And she wrote a lot about falling in love and then falling out of love, being in love with someone who no longer loves you, being in love with someone who might be in love with you but finds it difficult to be around women. And so her poems of the period are extremely psychological. They have a strong element of internal exploration and the exploration of subtle and intense feelings from a particularly feminine point of view. And like I said, this was a very new and exciting thing for the period and drew her wide admiration. As I said, Akhmatova and Gumilyov's marriage was not a happy or a stable one, and they divorced in 1918. However, Akhmatova was still considered to be closely connected to him, and when he was executed in 1921, she also fell under official disapproval and was not allowed to publish. She herself was also not a big fan of the Soviet regime. Unlike, for example, Blok, she did not throw herself into supporting it. Instead, she sort of stood aside from it aloofly. And between that and the execution of her husband, she became someone who is considered to be not quite an enemy of the people. She herself was never actually arrested and put into the Gulag system, but she was not allowed to publish. She was kept in fairly dire poverty, throughout most of the 1920s and 1930s. And her son Lev, that she had with Gumilyov, was arrested repeatedly starting in the 1930s because of his connection to Nikolai Gumilyov. So Lev spent a number of years in and out of the Gulag system, and Akhmatova spent a lot of her time in that period trying to find out where he was and trying to bring him parcels of food. So a major aspect of the Gulag system and that time is that family members could try to find out what had happened to people, and they could send what were basically care packages if they could find out what had happened to their loved ones in the Gulag, but it was quite difficult. And so there were places that would give out information and accept care packages, but you normally had to stand in line for a very long time to talk to anyone. By a very long time, I mean days at a stretch. It was like trying to get Final Four tickets or something like that, but every day, all day for years. And so she stood in line amongst all these other women. It was almost entirely women looking for their husbands and sons and brothers. So although many women were also arrested and put into the Gulag system, like, for example, Yevgenia Ginsburg, author of Into the Whirlwind, it was mainly men who were arrested, and then their wives, sisters, and mothers were not arrested, but were placed under suspicion and surveillance and had to spend all of their time trying to find out what had happened to their husbands, their brothers, or their sons, and try to get them care packages so that they wouldn't starve or freeze to death. And so Anna Andreevna spent a lot of time standing in line and getting a good hard look at what the Gulag system was like for the family members of those arrested. And this is what inspired her to write her cycle Requiem, or Requiem, which of course could not be published at the time, but she decided to write a description of and a testament to this experience. As she says at the beginning of it that as she was standing in line, a woman next to her discovered that she was a poet and said, "Can you write about this? Can you describe this?" And Akhmatova said, "I can." And she did. In her description of it, she is a no one's ever heard of her, and they're just curious to discover that she's a poet. The reality apparently was that she was still very well known and beloved, and many of the other women in line knew who she was and were horrified to discover that even Anna Akhmatova had to join them standing in line like this. Despite all of this, Akhmatova refused to emigrate. This set her apart from many other writers of the time, in that she did not support the regime, but she also did not want to emigrate. She considered it her duty, apparently, to stay there in Russia. And as she said in the epigraph to Requiem, "I was with my people then, there where my people, unfortunately, were. Я была тогда с моим народом, там, где мой народ, к несчастью, был." And so she seemed to consider it her duty or her role in life to act as a witness to these times and to stand with Russia even when Russia wasn't standing with her. Anna Akhmatova was living in Leningrad, as she had been for years, when World War II broke out. As you probably know, Leningrad was encircled during World War II, and there was a 900-day siege. Conditions there were very grim, and many people starved to death. Anna Akhmatova was there for the first year of this siege, and then in 1942, she, like many other artists, was evacuated, eventually to Tashkent. During World War II, the restrictions on many artists, including Akhmatova, were relaxed, as we discussed in the history lecture. And this was in order to help boost morale, so as well as kind of official propaganda, all kinds of other stuff was allowed during this period. And Akhmatova was allowed to perform readings, and she frequently read to soldiers in hospitals or on the front lines as part of a morale-boosting exercise. And again, people still knew who she was. She was still famous, she was still beloved, and she was seen as a great patriot because, of course, she hadn't left. She had stayed in Russia, and here she was giving readings to soldiers during this terrible time in Russian history. As soon as the war was over, however, she was again a persona non grata. She again experienced repression. In 1945, she was officially called a half harlot, half nun, and officially condemned, and was no longer allowed to write. Or rather, it would be better to say that she was no longer allowed to publish. She had been writing all throughout this period. Much of her stuff, unfortunately, was lost, but some of it was preserved, like Requiem. During these periods of repression, she would write poems, show them to people briefly, and then burn them. And this was part of a kind of a ritual that they developed where people would come visit her. She would show them a poem she had written. They would admire it for a few minutes and then burn it and wash the ashes down the sink. So she was again repressed in the later part of the 1940s. Her son was arrested again in 1949. And when this happened, she finally began writing pro-Stalin works. Of course, that is a controversial thing to do, but people generally understand why she did it, and her decision to do it may have saved both their lives. Her son was eventually released, and she was not arrested. She was allowed to continue in freedom, quote unquote, because she didn't actually have a lot of freedom, but she was not thrown into the Gulag system. And she and her son both survived the Stalinist repressions. Stalin died in 1953, and in 1956, what was known as the thaw started under Khrushchev. And at that point, her reputation was rehabilitated. So lots of artists suddenly received a great deal more freedom in this thaw period. That's why it's called the thaw. And she was allowed to publish again. So she published a couple of collections in 1956 and 1958. And then in 1965, she was shortlisted for the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, she didn't win it, but she was shortlisted for it. And her reputation was almost completely rehabilitated in the late 50s and early 60s. And she finally had the recognition and the freedom that she deserved. Most English speakers, if they know one Russian poet, that poet is Anna Akhmatova. Not Pushkin, not Lermontov, not Tsvetaeva, not Blok, not Mayakovsky, but Anna Akhmatova. And why is that? Well, for one reason, her poems are comparatively easy to translate into English. Her writing style translates well. Of course, you lose a lot, as you do with any translation, but the simplicity and the universality of what she was writing about makes what she did translate very easily. She also, of course, was extremely well-known and beloved in Russia, which helped. She was both acceptable enough to the Soviet regime to not be killed and to even be allowed to publish in the latter years of her life. At the same time, she was not a pro-Soviet poet like, for example, Mayakovsky, whom we'll discuss next week. So that made her more acceptable to Western readers. Western readers have kind of a hard time sympathizing with Mayakovsky's writing or the writing of other pro-Soviet poets. But Akhmatova's writing is so universal, and her themes are so universal that it's easy to sympathize with her, and she's not tainted by an association with the Soviet regime. So those are some of the reasons why she's so well known in the West. What did she do for Russian literature? Well, she was one of the first major female poets in Russia. She, along with Marina Tsvetaeva, started writing at the same time, and they were seen as this new thing in Russian literature in which women were starting to write and write serious poetry that was also about feminine themes and had a feminine voice, but was nonetheless obviously serious poetry. She, as I mentioned, was a founder of the Tsech Poetov, the Guild of Poets, and one of the most prominent Acmeist writers. And Acmeism, as I said in the lecture on it, was a short-lived movement that was only in Russia, but nonetheless an extremely important and prominent, well-known movement. And she brought this specifically female voice and female sensibility and female style and female themes into Russian poetry. At the same time, you didn't have to be a woman to appreciate it. Anyone could appreciate her intensely psychological poetry, her plumbing the depths of the nuances of human relationships and human feelings. She started off writing in this Acmeist style and helped develop it. In her later years, she moved to a more modernist style. I would hesitate to call her a modernist, but her long epic work, Poema bez Geroja, or Poem Without a Hero, is sometimes called modernist. It's also considered to be one of the best and most complex works of 20th century poetry, so you might not sit down and read it just for funsies, but it is a masterpiece. Maybe one of her most enduring masterpieces, however, is Requiem, or Requiem, which is both a tremendous work of poetry, but also performed this incredibly important cultural or social function as far as giving voice to the families of those in the Gulag system. So we have camp literature like, for example, Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, or Shalamov's Kolyma Tales, that gave voice to the people in the Gulag system, which was incredibly important. Akhmatova's Requiem gave voice to the families of those in the Gulag system and what it was like to not know where your loved ones were and to try and find them and to spend these hundreds and hundreds of hours standing in line trying to find out anything about them. And so she had both this incredible literary importance as far as founding a new movement and a new style and being one of the very first important female voices in Russian literature, and this incredibly important and unique social role of giving voice to a largely voiceless and repressed community, the families of people who had been caught up in the Gulag system. So if you're going to impress Russians with your knowledge of poetry, it's always handy to be able to talk about Pushkin, because then they'll be like, oh, of course you love Pushkin. We all love Pushkin. You're one of us now. If you're going to impress non-Russians with your knowledge of Russian poetry, Anna Akhmatova is the poet you need to know.